Do you like to use ultralight lures with your spinning tackle, but you're constantly running into problems with knots in your line? I'm going to show you how you can fix that with a few easy steps. My name's Captain Chris Myers. I'm a 20-year fishing guide down here in Florida. And sometimes, even in the saltwater, we're using really tiny lures to catch big fish. And I use nothing but braid. And having watched hundreds and hundreds of people fish, I can 100% say that using lighter lures can lead to more knots in the braided line that sometimes you have to cut off and throw away, which I would rather not do. The number one reason that you're getting knots in your line is because these light lures do not pull tight and wrap that line on the spool tightly. So when you cast the next time, instead of it flowing off one wrap at a time, multiple wraps jump over the spool and cause the knot. And it's almost always when your lure is way out, almost at the end of the cast, then the knot comes off. And if you can't get it off, you have to cut off a whole bunch of line. You do that 2 or 3 times, then you got to refill your whole spool. The secret is to never let that line get loose, especially on those first few wraps, but anytime during the cast. And I'm going to show you how I combat that issue with the super light lures, but this applies to any kind of lure you're fishing with, but especially ultralight tackle. When I'm casting, I want to be certain that I'm not casting in a big rainbow arc, so that when my line comes down to the water, it all floats on down, and now my lure is not tight between the tip and that line entering the water. I reel up now, I'm going to get loose, 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 loose. So I turn the handle 4 or 5 times. That's bail went around, who knows how many. It's usually 5 or 6 to 1. So I might have put 20 wraps of loose line on there just by turning the handle a few times. Now the lure is tight. These wraps are going on nice and tight, probably not going to jump off near as often as it would if it were loose. Cast in straight lines is tip number 1. Tip number 2, which goes hand in hand with every single cast I make, no matter what I'm casting, what kind of lure I'm casting, where I'm casting, I'm using this finger to stop extra line from coming off that spool when the lure hits the water, and I'm stopping the line just before my lure hits the water. The momentum of the lure yanks my line tight. I'm always starting the retrieve with a tight line. So when I make that cast, right now, the lure kept moving for a foot or 2, pulled my line tight. I stopped it. I didn't get extra line coming off. And certainly if it's windy, the wind can blow a ton of line extra off your spool after your lure is already landed, which means you have to get that out of there. Now I'm starting with a tight retrieve. If you make a mistake, and for one reason or the other, you get a whole bunch of loose line. Either you threw it up in a big arc, or the wind blew a whole bunch off because you didn't stop it, and you had all this loose line. I do not, under any circumstance, want to start reeling this on here. 1 or 2 ways to get rid of that. I close the bail. If there's not a whole bunch of it, I can reach back with my tip, point away from where my lure is out there, pulled my line tight. If I had so much I couldn't even do that, I can put the reel in the other hand for a second, grab around the rod, put that line in between my 2 fingers, reel it as I'm pinching my fingers till the line gets tight. Now I can come back down here and reel like normal. I got to be sure that I'm not putting that line on that spool loose. Those 2 things will really, really help it out. The only way you can stop that line with your finger, that is my break, whether I'm casting towards trees or out in the open water, every cast has a break. I must be holding it in between my last 2 fingers. If you're currently holding it down here, as this line is coming off the spool, it's very, very hard unless you got giant hands to stop it. Hold it in between your last 2 fingers. You'll be able to have this finger as a brake. Use that brake while the lure is still in motion. Just before it's hit, it'll yank your line nice and tight. Now that you fixed the issue with the initial cast and the first few feet of the retrieve, getting that line to go on there tight, now it's very important that during the whole retrieve, you're keeping that line coming on here tight. And the way that I have seen over many, many fishing trips with people, this come to be a problem, is when they're retrieving, they twitch the lure, put it back, then turn the handle. Well, I just threw in 3-4 feet of slack. However far you're putting it back before you turn it, that was slack. My line is loose now. Now I'm getting loose, loose, loose. Twitch it up, line's tight, purposely making it slack, then cranking it up. Tight, 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 slack, tight, 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 slack. If you want to avoid that issue, it is going to be critically important that as you're twitching this lure, you are twitch, twitch, freeze, turn. Freeze, turn. So I'm never going back towards the lure with my tip until I've started turning the handle. If you're in a boat, the faster the boat is moving, the faster you're going to have to turn that handle. If you're standing on the shore, you wouldn't have to do it quite as fast, but you have to turn it fast enough to keep that tight. And the other advantage is not only will it stop you from getting these knots on the spool, it's going to prevent your line wrapping around your tip. If that line is tight from your tip to the lure, there's no way this line can ever jump around my tip. This line, when it gets loose, if I twitch it and then throw it back in here, it jumps around the tip. If I twitch it, throw it back up, twitch it, throw it back up, not every time, just like you won't get a knot every time, but sooner or later, it's going to wrap around your tip. And I have fished with anglers that have had to put their rod down, unwrap their tip dozens of times during the day because they're not keeping the line tight. And they're generally the same anglers who end up with quite a few knots in those spools during the day. So when you're fishing ultralights, very important, keep that line tight. Do not begin that retrieve before you have tightened up the line, and keep it tight all the way through. That will allow you to cast really, really light stuff with braided line without getting a bunch of knots. Now, final bonus tip that will help you with all kinds of casting. The more line you put on this spool, the more you fill this up to the edge, the easier this comes off. If I'm fishing ultralight lures, I want it pretty full so that I don't have to cast really, really hard every single cast. Not only does it become tiresome, but it makes those wraps want to jump off the spool more. However, the more you have that up to the edge, the less friction there is when you make this cast. This line is touching the edge of that spool. If you have another reel with less line, say like this one, this particular reel that I have has quite a bit less line. And the reason it has less line is because on my last trip, the person got 3 or 4 knots during the trip. We had to keep cutting off line. As this line comes off, there's a lot more friction on that lip, which means it's not as easy for that to jump over the edge, but there's more resistance to the cast. I'm not going to get as much casting distance. So if you want to get extra casting distance with light lures, you could fill that thing up, but you got to be ultra careful you are keeping it tight. So if this has helped you not get so many knots in your braid, or if you've been getting knots and you have some other tips you think anglers would benefit from, leave a comment below, like this video. If you enjoy this kind of stuff, become a subscriber. I got lots of fishing videos on how you can prevent problems with your spinning reels, and you can check out this one right here.